Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Hello, welcome back, Engagers. This week we have Vince from Hong Kong. And before we get started, Vince, are you prepared to engage?
Absolutely.
Let's do this because Vince Siu, and I'm not sure if I got that last name right, but I hope I did. He is the co-founder and managing partner at Press Start Hong Kong, which is a games consultancy with a mission to change the world through play and games, and leads the Press Start Academy, its after-school education arm. He's also the founder and CEO of Epiphany and Labs, a boutique innovation consultancy with a social conscience. Outside of work, he is in a voluntary capacity. He serves as a Vice Curator of the Hong Kong hub of the Global Shapers Community, a youth leadership initiative by the World Economic Forum. I've had a couple of friends be part of the World Youth Leadership or something like that who've been through that, so I'm pretty excited about you being part of that initiative as well.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So Vince, is there anything we're leaving outside of this intro that you'd like to make sure that, everybody knows?
No, that's covers the gamut.
Fantastic. So Vince, we would like to know, with our guests, we always like to know a bit about their lives. Of course, there's the intro, but what does a regular day look like for Vince? And a day like today within the whole coronavirus situation or any other day, how does that look like?
Well, today is actually an interesting day because we just decided to cancel all our in-person classes for the Easter holidays because of the second wave of the coronavirus outbreak happening here in Hong Kong. So, yeah, there's been social distancing rules. There's not supposed to be any sort of gatherings of 4 people and above, which kind of puts classes, workshops, like in person, kind of puts that in jeopardy. So kind of working on moving things online. Actually, we've already done a couple online classes, but now we're going to be moving all of our Easter programs online. So there's that.
Yeah, that makes sense. In these times, at the university I'm at, we're fully online now, 100%.
Yeah.
We did have a lot of blended programs before, so kind of the technology, we knew kind of what we had to do, but of course it's designing a program as a blended program and taking it face-to-face, like in a short amount of time into a blended situation or online situation is kind of a different story, but we did have some, some advantages from the previous experience. So good luck with that.
For sure. And I tip my hat to all of you guys in education and full-time. Having taught online myself over the is hard. So thanks for doing the hard work, guys.
Yeah, it's different. I'm not sure if it's harder or less difficult in any case for some people. What I do know is that the whole change and the shaping of something, again, not from scratch, because you kind of know those things, but it's a different format. You have to engage people in a different way. So it's a very interesting thing to take a look at. In fact, one of the past episodes by now, and it was a live I had with Dustin Stats, we were talking precisely about games and gamification and how that shift to online could be done and what are the advantages and challenges of such a situation. So we're definitely on the same page in that sense.
For sure.
So Vince, can you tell us a story of something that you would perhaps like to call your favorite fail or first attempt in learning? Of course, hopefully it'll involve some games or gamification. And of course, we want to know what happened, how it went down, how did you come out of it, or what lessons, or both, what lessons did you take from that?
So I think creating games or game-like experiences, it's a very educational process in and of itself. And I guess my favorite failure is our first project when we just approached it with a blank slate. And I've since learned that having constraints imposed upon you is actually a good thing, especially when it comes to games. So let me give you a little backstory, right? And This is our first real sort of corporate, well, I wouldn't say corporate, but sort of gamification consulting project that we did with an educational institution here in Hong Kong called the Polytechnic University of Hong Kong. So I woke up one day and saw an email sitting in our inbox. It was in our general email inbox, and these guys didn't even know like our names, and they just said like, "Dear sir, madam, we are professors blah and blah from the Hong Kong Polytechnic University Institute of Textiles and Clothing. We would like to design a board game, teach fashion business concepts, and we would like to ask if you guys would do that." At this point, it was around a year in, and Press Start was still a part-time venture for us. So we had never really done anything of the sort. We had done very simple things before, but being the entrepreneurs, wannabe entrepreneurs that we were, we said yes. And miraculously, we sort of landed the deal. But these guys were very fixated on designing a game, but they had no idea what they wanted to design the game about. And we thought this was going to be the easiest thing because, hey, they had no requirements. But actually, it's the hardest thing to work with a client or a project scope that has no requirements because you have to build them yourselves. As I'm sure you know, Rob, a game itself is bound by a lot of rules, and it's built by rules. There's an environment that you have to build the rules for. There are players that you have to build the rules for. So coming at it from literally zero guidelines was actually super challenging. And our lesson learned there is it's always good to ask for constraints, and if they don't know what the constraints are, to work with them to set up the constraints first and to know where their boundaries lie and know where their objectives are, because that in turn actually helps you a lot on the design journey.
That sounds very, very sensible of a conclusion for sure. I would just like to have a small follow-up. Is there any like situation, of course, again, you don't need to name any names or anything too specific, but just to get an idea of how this like bit you back when you didn't have those constraints, like what was an example of a problem you faced in this situation?
Yeah, so what ended up happening was we just had to go through like many, many more playtests than we had budgeted for. And like, just to give you an example, because they wanted to design something for to teach fashion business, right? Now, what kinds of concepts exist in fashion business or in the fashion industry in general? I mean, it's the entire industry. So if we start off brainstorming about fashion design or running a department store or curating like a fashion show, these are all completely different things that our client was all interested in. And we had to find out by trial and error that, hey, actually, it's hard to do a game about fashion design because fashion design in itself is quite a subjective topic. It's hard to design rules for subjective topics like that. Now, if we had, let's say, budgeted for like 6 months of the initial game design, we were probably thinking about like 4 rounds of tests. But because we had to go through this trial and error process, we actually ended up going through like 8 to 10 rounds. And this was on an agreed budget already, so we just had to eat up the costs.
This just happens.
For sure.
One of the things I can tell you from my experience at IE Publishing as well in the university, in the department we create interactive online, especially learning materials. And one of the things that is hardest to get when you sit down with the subject matter expert, in this case, as in yours, is the teacher, the professor. So one of the hardest things is getting to sit down this very, very smart, super intelligent, super talented, and very knowledgeable person and tell them, you know, this, let's say we were mostly with the business school, so let's say it's a marketing professor. And the marketing professor, of course, is going to design something for marketing. But then he or she starts thinking like, oh, yeah, but this is so interesting that if we put some numbers as well, maybe it could be used in finance. And, you know, given the strategic level of these decisions, this could be used as well in strategy. And, you know, there's a lot of people involved. So maybe HR objectives could be in. And you start like going all over the place. And it's like, no. Wait a second. Why don't we focus on that one thing that you want to make sure it pulls through, and whatever else comes out of it, you know, it's a gaining, you know, it's a bonus, it's a happenstance. But if we don't focus on one thing, then we won't be doing any of the other things well as well. So I completely can relate to that situation that you were in.
I can completely relate to yours too.
I mean, it's literally the world we live in. And of course, again, it's not because anybody is, out of the pot or, doesn't know what he or she is doing. It's just because it's very, very, very easy to fall into that sort of trap of, but this can be used for all these other things as well. And even though that might be true, if you don't focus on one thing and do that, astoundingly and amazingly well, that there are going to be consequences in it, and not only in it being longer and more tedious, but even in doing a good job at that core thing that you were focusing on or not focusing on, in fact. So absolutely, this is something I think is a key lesson that we can take from your story, like understanding those constraints, and those constraints can even come in the form of what it is that you want to teach. And of course, delving deep, if you had known from the start it was design, well, how do you do design, and what are the rules, or maybe the rules are in a different way. What you want to just have is like peer recognition, or you have a facilitator who is going to be judging the rules, or whatever that looks like. However, if you had known that from the start, I'm sure it would have been, simpler for you to be able to manage those expectations.
For sure.
So in that same sense of a story and a situation in which you guys were designing for a company, a school, a university, whatever that was, I'd like to know of a time when you set out to do something, and it actually, it could have been in the first or the second round or the 10th round, it doesn't matter. But you set out to do something, and you can call it like a success, something that you're proud of. We want to, be there with you and find out like some of the key lessons that you got from that, some of the key elements that you would attribute that success to.
So I think one of the things that I enjoy the most is not just to design the game itself or the game experience itself, but to create the environment where the educational elements or the learning takes place. And very frequently, when it comes to corporate clients, then this is designing the case study or the debriefing kit that the HR people or the professors in the case just now would be using for the participants of that experience. And that's something that I think is very fun. And it also creates a lot of meaning, and it brings value to whoever we're working with. So last year we worked on a project with McDonald's in Hong Kong. And this was part of their talent recruitment drive. So every year they have like a management associate program that hires top tier university students to actually go and work like on the floor, like on the kitchen floor, shop floor in a McDonald's branch. And then they sort of move up to a bigger branch and they become restaurant manager and so on. And they move up and up and up. And then at the end of the program, they move back to corporate to sort of contribute towards the like middle office and back office functions to continue growing the company. And they have this really sort of prolonged and comprehensive multi-stage interview process. And their first challenge to us was, can you make the candidate experience more enjoyable, more collaborative? Because what we want to assess our candidates for wasn't just, their academic skills or their critical thinking. It was for their leadership and teamwork and collaboration and like creativity and all the other sort of like soft skills that you would need in a position like that. Now, these are really good constraints, right? But how would it be possible for us to build something that would also be aligned with what they wanted to achieve and also be fun for the candidates going through that experience? And so that was actually quite a big challenge for us because we had to think about the constraints that were given, which were we had to assess for, let's say, 8 to 10 things within 3 hours. And each sort of group interview size was like 50 people. And we would only be working with 10 like HR assessors on their side. So what we had to do was we had to sort of reverse engineer something that would work first to meet all of these constraints. And then we would have to create something that would be fun for the candidates. So we ended up doing 2 games, actually. So around an hour and a half each. The first half was going to be more of a competitive experience. So it was like an F&B entrepreneurship card game where people were the candidates in a team would be creating their own restaurant concepts, and they would be pitching to each other, and there would be different Q&A rounds and like follow-up rounds and expansion rounds and things like that. And then the second half would be a collaborative experience that was based on like tabletop role-playing games. So what was interesting was the first team, the team that at first would be competing against each other would have to become like collaborative partners in the same restaurant, working through a case study in the form of a role-playing game. And we did not tell this to the participants beforehand. So if there was like a lot of cutthroat competition in the beginning and then they had to turn around and work as a team, we saw quite a lot of like interesting dynamics like sort of play up, which was really cool. And the most interesting thing for us was when we facilitated like the debrief for the HR team using the assessment matrix that we created in accordance with both of the game experiences. Basically, all of the feedback across all of the candidates was pretty universal. And so like what we found out and what like our clients found out was that if you use a game-like experience like this and you know where to assess candidates in terms of how they interact within a game, then it actually makes the entire assessment process a lot easier, because I'm sure you've heard like the saying where while playing games, you truly know someone. And we found that to be the truth. And that was super interesting.
Yeah, it is. And I'm sure we've all heard that before in this podcast or elsewhere. Of, you know, you bring your true personality, or it actually comes out when you're playing a game, almost for sure, when it's, you know, it's when it's getting intense, and after a while when you're in that sort of magic circle or flow or whatever you want to put it in, and that makes a lot of sense. And I'm happy to hear that you had such a successful journey on that one. Is it a program that is still being implemented, or was it a sort of a one-off for that client?
It's still being implemented. So yeah, as part of the engagement, we customized these games, and we also did, like, at the end of that engagement last year, we also had a handoff sort of training session for their HR team. So we basically did this, facilitated like the first time for them, and then we trained them to continue on with it. So they'll be doing that again this year.
That's beautiful. That's fantastic. And we've been talking about a couple of experiences you've had in this sense, a super successful one, another one in which you had a lot of lessons learned as well. But it sure means that you have some way of approaching these problems, these situations in which you consult, in which you create games, or these playful situations. Do you have some sort of structured process or non-structured process? Like, how do you approach any of these problems that you face? That somebody comes up and says, Vince, we have this problem. How can you help us? How do you approach that?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that I always ask a prospective client is, are you sure that a game is what you need? Because very often you find people who are attracted by the term gamification without fully understanding what it can do or what it can't do, right? And so it's very important to establish that having a game experience or having gamification does not always solve all of your problems. And so the first thing that we have to solve together is, what at the core, what are you trying to solve? And I guess I'm lucky in the sense that I came from, like, my previous corporate experience was in consulting, so management consulting. So I did a lot of innovation strategy. I did a lot of design thinking, a lot of like internal training and facilitation, as well as a sort of side construct of all the consulting work that we were doing. And so using that sort of design process, the design thinking process, is actually generally quite helpful. And so you're ending up trying to design experiences that help who you're trying to help and help who they're trying to help. And so working together to come up with these objectives is, first of all, of value to our clients. And then if it so happens that, actually we can design a game experience to help solve that, then great. If not, then hopefully we have already delivered value, and that keeps them coming back for future scenarios.
Of course it does. And again, once you set those objectives, what would be the next steps that you take? How do you if you can reveal this, of course, I don't know if it's like a trademark or anything, but what does your process of creating these solutions look like?
So I don't know that there is like a set process per se.
Okay.
However, using the design thinking process where we are looking at who we're trying to solve things for, and then what are the things we're trying to solve, that actually narrows the field down by quite a bit. And in the case of game-based experiences or programs or curriculum, I go back to the same sort of principle where it is the most important thing to know where your constraints are. So we actually spend a lot of time trying to define what the constraints are. So if it's something, like you said, like a in-person facilitation thing, then how many people is it going to be? What's the space we're going to use? What's the client department or departments that we're working with? What objectives do they want to hit? How much time do we have? And we sort of reverse engineer whatever we're trying to do based on those objectives first. And then it's an iterative process. The good thing is at this point, we've done enough client projects to kind of have references that we can sort of bring off the shelf and be like, okay, this project seems like, after all of those thought processes, we can use this kind of model. And then we find out where in that sort of model we can make tweaks so we don't have to start from scratch every single time. And then it just becomes whether it's actually producing a product and delivering that product in the training or helping to facilitate and whatnot. And those things are actually quite flexible because we're pretty used to that by now.
That sounds like a lot of fun.
It absolutely is.
Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification. So Vince, that sounds all fantastic. And I would like to know, with all your experience, all the things that you've done, would you say that there is some sort of best practice or some idea that you say, well, if you include this when you're thinking about these solutions or thinking about the objectives even, that would be like not a silver bullet, but something that would always help make your project better?
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer because I think different projects have different things that they try to achieve. And, you mentioned that at the beginning in the introduction that I also run a small boutique innovation consultancy, and we run into these challenges all the time where it is about trying to align client expectations with their objectives and with the delivery format. And very often it's super easy to just sort of brush over everything and say, oh, you just apply this and everything will be good. But the best results are always achieved when all of those things are aligned and you spend the most time trying to align them. I know I'm being quite vague, but in the case of, say, building an innovation challenge, because we actually have a game that we co-designed that teaches entrepreneurship and design thinking. It's a card game. It's a storytelling game. And in the case of designing an innovation challenge, a lot of times it makes a lot of sense to ask the client whether they are designing this to upskill and build capacity within their employees on how to innovate and how to use design thinking, or if they're actually looking for actual outcomes and ideas and strategies at the end of it. Because believe it or not, those two experiences could look quite different because you're putting emphases on very different aspects throughout the innovation journey, throughout the game journey, and how and where you do the debrief and how and where you find and construct those learning points and learning experiences actually differs massively depending on the objective. So yeah, a lot of times it is, I know I'm beating a dead horse by continually bringing up finding the constraints, finding the objectives, but that actually sprinkles through the entire process as you're trying to reverse engineer it.
Well, finding them early on and, on time and having them very well defined could be definitely that sort of best practice, so to speak.
Absolutely.
And what would you say after hearing these questions? I know you have somebody you know was already interviewed actually in the week that we're recording. That was one of the interviews that's already live. And I just forgot Peter Williamson's name for a second. But besides Peter, of course, is there anybody else that you would think and say, well, I would really like to listen to this person in an interview like this one. I would like to get those insights from this person. Who would that be?
So I have a good friend. His name is Joey Lee, and he directs the Games Research Lab at the Teachers College of Columbia University. And he also teaches and he sort of coordinates the Digital Games Masters program. And he's a very interesting person. And I catch up with him quite often. I regard him as sort of like an advisor to what we sort of do, especially in the education realm, because he has designed educational games and he actively does a lot of research on how games impact learning. And so actually, as we've been building out Press Start Academy for the past few months, a lot of that has been based on like initial conversations that I've had with him on what he thinks about gamification in education and so on.
He sounds like a very exciting person to talk to, so we'll definitely try to get in touch as well.
Sure.
So again, in the sense of recommendations, we've been talking about already that person, but is there a book that you would recommend to an audience like this one, to the engagers? And what book would that be and why?
Sure. I give a lot of talks on gamification, and what I like to start off with is a quick glance of the role of games throughout history, because, understanding, like we see games as an art form. So we like thinking about sort of the human condition through what games people are playing and what games people are sort of designing at a certain period in time. And I came across this book last year. I really enjoyed it. It's called Wonderland by Steven Johnson. And it's basically a history of how play and playfulness has impacted major innovations throughout history. So he covers like luxury shopping and like music and like public space design, right? And one of the things that was, I guess, one of the standout examples to me was the emergence or the invention, so to speak, of the department store. Now, a lot of us don't think of department stores as game-like experiences, but in fact, it was actually designed and invented for no reason other than to delight customers and to provide a sensory experience that would like overwhelm, elicit joy and fun and a sense of wonder in people. And I remember the first concept of a department store was to build a, quote, cathedral of commerce. And so it was to, for the first time in history, to turn a regular shop that sells regular products into an experience that would be sort of game-like or playful, so people would be compelled to buy things that they were amazed by. And that was like super interesting to me. And obviously he has a lot more anecdotes for like, say, like music boxes and like design of like strip malls and things. So that was super cool.
Sounds very interesting. I'm not sure if I'm getting the right person, but there used to be, and he just did a few episodes of this podcast, and he was talking about a book he wrote. So can you say the name again? Wonderland by Steven Johnson. Steven Johnson. Yeah, I think it's the same person, but I'm not sure now. I'm just looking it up. But he's a very, very, if it's the same person, it's a very interesting character. I haven't read the book, but it would definitely make it now to my reading list just about this time. So again,
sure, yeah.
We've been talking about other people and your recommendation about what other people are doing and their books, etc. And what would you say is, in your case, your superpower? And again, as I've said many times, superpowers are not exclusive. It's not like only Flash is super fast. I mean, Superman's also super fast. I don't know, the strength of Hulk. There's the Thing as well in Marvel Universe. It's not exclusive, but what's that thing that you would say is, your sweet spot, that strong point that you say, well, this is something I'm really great at and I excel at it?
So I mentioned just now that I really quite enjoy deriving and creating the learning points, the educational experiences and the debrief, right? So I guess I enjoy it because I'm quite good at it. And that's sort of the foundation on which I'm building Press Start Academy. And so really at the core of it, it's taking games that aren't normally designed to be educational and sort of creating educational curriculum or narratives using those. And because they weren't designed to be educational, that means that they are fun first and foremost. And if they're fun first and foremost, then it's much easier to create educational experiences from that.
Sounds very exciting and very interesting. So good idea to have that as your superpower for sure. And I would like to know also, and this might be a difficult question as for many other guests, what would you say is your favorite game?
Oh yeah, I anticipated this question, so I spent probably 12 hours thinking about that.
Some prep work.
I quite enjoy a board game called Above and Below. I don't know if you've played it before, but it's a quite interesting game. And to me, when I first played it, it was a very new experience. So Above and Below, it's a very simple sort of context, a very simple story where you are trying to build a village to settle your villagers. And so you have to sort of build the houses, and you have to sort of train the different craftspeople to go in and live in the different houses. So there's a lot of the strategy and the resource management side. However, this new village site also happens to sit on top of some vast caverns. And so in order for you to to get the resources, you can go to explore the caverns down below. And so that's where you have the above side, like building the village up top, and below where you're going exploring and cave diving. And actually a part of the game is there is actually a book inside that is like a choose your own adventure type storybook, where when you're rolling dice, when you're managing your resources, you're actually flipping through the book according to your dice rolls and being like, you have encountered something in the caves. Here are your decision points. And so it's kind of like the best of both worlds, where you have a strategy board game and you have Dungeons and Dragons all in one go. So it's amazing.
I can see there's a lot of complexity there. That a board game, right?
Yes, it's a board game. And nice. Yeah, there's so much like storytelling. There's a lot of like educational value that you can sort of derive from it too.
Interesting. Sounds like a very nice game. I've definitely never played it, but again, it could be into that want to play list coming up for me. Sure. And it seems like we are fairly good on time, so we will have time for the random question this time. And I'm going to pick, well, I'm not going to pick, it's going to randomly come up one of those questions from the audience. And the idea is that you get your best, stab at what your answer would be.
I will try my best.
Okay, here it comes. And I think this will come in handy for this conversation. This person says, I've heard a lot about playtesting. However, when it comes to it, I am a bit lost as to what should I do. How do I find the test players, etc.? What would you, Vince, in this case, recommend?
Ooh, that is hard. I guess the first thing that I would like to ask this person is, are they designing a game that they plan to sell or put up on Kickstarter as a product, or if they are designing a game for a specific client? Because if it's the latter, then at some point you got to have the client test it out. And when you work backwards, it is, let's say I'm designing a game, in your example, Rob, for a marketing professor or for a marketing department. Then before you find someone in marketing to test it out, then you probably want to find people who work in marketing to try and help you or give you some pointers first, and then to try it out first. Also, finding other people who like playing games in general, just to test out the game mechanics and make sure that they think it's fun. Now, for the former case where you are just designing a product to release into retail, then I think actually that is quite different, and you really need to figure out who you're trying to design this for. If you're designing a long strategy game, then you probably don't want to find someone who enjoys playing only casual games to test. You have to be able to know how to explain the rules really well, or you find someone who is generally good at that and you teach them how to play the game so they're able to run the playtest for you, because very often there's a loss in translation type scenario where you're the game designer, you know exactly what's going on, and then you fail to communicate adequately to the people who have no idea what's going on.
That sounds like a known situation.
Absolutely, yes. And I think, like finding game enthusiasts first is always the key, because they would be the first people that are interested in what you're doing no matter what, and they will try to help you along the way. And then it's about who you're trying to target. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, it does. Sounds fantastic, actually. So thank you very much for those recommendations. I think there's a lot of value there. There's a lot of experience as well, as I can see from this point at least. And I'd like to know if you have any final quick piece of advice you want to leave us with. Of course, let us know where we can find you and Press Start Hong Kong. And then we'll say that it's game over. Sure. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Press Start Hong Kong. If anyone wants to get in touch, my email address is Vince, VINCE, at pressstart.com.hk. And I guess I just encourage everyone to play more and to think about
games and game experiences, not just from the perspective of a player where you're trying to enjoy the game and like trying to figure out how to win, but also from like a game designer's point of view. I see games as a simplified version of reality and or an interpretation of the worlds that the game designer has selected. And so, yeah, it's a lot of fun when you try to sort of take a step back and try to figure out why and how the game is designed the way it is. And then there's a lot of gamification that can be done.
Absolutely, absolutely. So thank you very much, Vince, for investing this time in us and the engagers. And everybody who's listening, I'm sure you will find a lot of value in all of your words, all of your experience, your recommendations, process, etc., etc. But however, for now, and at least for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Engagers, thank you for listening to the Professor Game podcast. And if you want more interviews with incredible guests like Vince, then go to professorgame.com/subscribe and get started on our email list. We can be in contact. You'll know the latest news. I'll be reminding you a couple of things. I'm definitely not spammy. And we can be in contact. So please go ahead and go to professorgame.com/subscribe and get subscribed to our email list. And of course, I hope to see you next week. So you can also subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.